It began with laughter, the kind of sharp, confident laughter that echoed through the hangars of Rabaul and Truk Lagoon, where Japanese pilots, proud veterans of years of sky dominance, stood around the nose of their Mitsubishi Zeros, polishing the sleek, ivory-white wings of the fighters that had once ruled the Pacific. They had reason to laugh. The Zero had been the terror of the early war, fast, agile, and unmatched in maneuverability. It could twist and climb like a swallow and outturn anything the Americans had. To the pilots of the rising sun, the sky was their empire, and every dogfight was a dance of precision and pride. So when word spread in late 1943 that the Americans had rolled out a new carrier fighter, some lumbering beast called the Grumman F6F Hellcat, the reaction wasn't fear or caution. It was amusement. "A monster!" one Japanese lieutenant scoffed, tracing the outline of the Hellcat's bulky frame in the air. "Too heavy, too slow. It will fall before it fights." Others joined in, laughing, their voices rising over the engine noise of their idling Zeros. They had faced American planes before, Wildcats, Buffaloes, even P-40s, and cut them to ribbons. The Hellcat, they assumed, would be no different. But they didn't know what was coming. Because deep within a hidden hangar in Bethpage, New York, engineers at Grumman had been quietly building a monster the Japanese could never have imagined. A fighter designed not for grace, but for survival. Not for elegance, but for revenge. Its lines were brutal, its frame thick with armor plating, and its massive engine, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, could tear the sky apart with raw power. American pilots didn't need it to outturn the Zero. They needed it to outclimb it, outdive it, and come home alive. The Hellcat was born not from arrogance, but from blood. From the lessons learned over Midway and Wake, where too many U.S. flyers had died in machines too fragile to fight. When the first squadron of F-6Fs launched from the decks of USS Essex and USS Yorktown in the fall of 1943, the Pacific War shifted in silence. The Japanese didn't see it yet. They still flew their beloved Zeros with the same deadly confidence, still joked about the fat American planes as they lifted off into the tropical dawn. But that morning, when radar screens lit up with dots racing toward them, dots that climbed higher, faster than any plane they'd seen before, the laughter began to fade. Lieutenant Hiroshi Sato, one of the most experienced Zero aces over the Solomons, spotted the newcomers first. "New type," he radioed calmly. "Large engine. Not agile." But when he dived to engage, the large engine roared, and the Hellcat shot upward in a blinding climb that defied every expectation. The Zero's paper-thin wings flexed as Sato tried to follow, but he couldn't. The Hellcat vanished into the sun, then dropped behind him like a hawk. The first burst of 50-caliber tracers ripped across the Zero's fuselage, igniting it instantly. The wreck tumbled into the sea in a bloom of fire and smoke. In less than a minute, the myth of Japanese air invincibility cracked. Below deck on the USS Yorktown, an American mechanic watched the gun camera footage in silence, the screen flashing with white bursts of light, Zero after Zero falling from the sky. The Hellcat, that ugly monster, had just claimed its first dozen kills without a single loss. By dusk, the U.S. Navy pilots were silent too, not out of arrogance but disbelief. They had faced the enemy that had once ruled the skies, and they had crushed it. Yet for every cheer on the carrier decks, somewhere far over the Pacific, Japanese survivors were floating among the waves, staring at the burning remains of their comrades' planes, their laughter drowned by the hiss of fire on water. The age of the Zero had ended, and none of them had seen it coming. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was a statement that America had learned, adapted, and built an engine of vengeance. What the Japanese dismissed as heavy and clumsy turned out to be unstoppable. That night, as the first reports reached Tokyo, silence filled the command rooms. The Imperial Navy had no answer. One commander, stunned by the kill ratios, 12-1 in favor of the Americans, whispered, "The sky has turned against us." And indeed, it had. The laughter that had once filled the hangars of the Pacific Islands was gone, replaced by the low, distant growl of the Hellcat, a sound that signaled the beginning of the end for Japan's air empire. The first few encounters between the Hellcat and the Zero were so shocking. Even the U.S. Navy intelligence officers doubted the reports. Kill ratios of 8-to-1? 10-to-1? Impossible, they said. But the gun cam reels didn't lie. The flickering black and white film showed a story that was hard to believe. Zeros spiraling in smoke, one after another, against a backdrop of burning clouds. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 15, led by the unflappable Commander David McCampbell, had found the rhythm of their new machine, and the Hellcat was beginning to sing its song of dominance. The difference was visceral. When the Zero met the Wildcat, the Japanese pilot had dictated the fight. But against the Hellcat, the power dynamic flipped, brutally and completely. The Hellcat climbed where the Zero stalled, dove where the Zero disintegrated, and absorbed hits that would have turned any other aircraft into shrapnel. Its wings were thick with armor, its self-sealing tanks a miracle of survival. Pilots who once prayed before every sortie now felt something new: confidence. They no longer feared the dogfight. They hunted for it. The transformation wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. American pilots who had seen friends burn over Wake and Midway now looked at the sky differently. "The Hellcat," one flyer wrote in his log, "made us feel immortal." And for a time, they almost were. The Japanese command, reeling from the losses, struggled to understand what had changed. Their intelligence analysts blamed pilot training, fuel shortages, and fatigue. They didn't realize the truth yet. The Americans had built a plane specifically designed to destroy the Zero, and to do so mercilessly. The Hellcat's designers at Grumman had studied every scrap of data from downed Zeros recovered on Aleutian beaches and jungle islands. They knew its turning radius, its stall speed, its climb rate. They built the F6F to counter every one of those numbers. It wasn't meant to outturn the Zero. It was built to survive its first pass. Climb above it and crush it from superior altitude. That doctrine, hit fast, hit hard, dive away, turned the tide of the Pacific Air War. From Tarawa to the Marianas, American pilots flew with a vengeance. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats tore through waves of Japanese attackers, turning the sky into a storm of fire and falling wreckage. Pilots like McCampbell, Cecil Harris, and Alex Vrasiu carved their names into history that day. Vrasiu alone downed 6 Zeros in 8 minutes. The gunners on the carriers below stopped counting after a while. There were too many flaming trails streaking down toward the sea. What had begun with Japanese laughter ended with Japanese silence. But victory carried its own ghosts. After one particularly brutal day over the Philippines, Lieutenant Ensign Roger Hedrick landed his Hellcat, its fuselage riddled with bullet holes. He climbed out shaking, his gloves still smoking from the heat of the guns. "They never gave up," he said softly, "even when they knew they couldn't win." The deck crew nodded, their faces lit by the glow of burning wrecks in the distance. For all the pride they felt, the Americans also understood the tragedy behind their triumph. They were witnessing the death of an entire air force built on faith and courage, but undone by technology and exhaustion. As dusk fell, the Hellcats lined up for their next sortie. The air smelled of oil and cordite. Across the water, the last Japanese carriers were already on the run, their decks scarred, their pilots running out of fuel, out of planes, out of hope. The U.S. Navy's new beast had done its job too well. Above the ocean, the Hellcat silhouettes turned black against the dying sun. Steel angels avenging the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Coral Sea. The air war of 1943 was no longer the romantic duel of 1941. It had become a mechanical slaughterhouse in the sky. What began as graceful spirals and elegant turns now devolved into bursts of cannon fire, shredded aluminum, and smoke trails that fell like dying comets into the sea. For Japanese pilots who had once danced through dogfights with unmatched agility, facing the Hellcat was like running into a brick wall that could fly. They dove, rolled, twisted. But the American planes were always there, engines roaring, guns blazing, wings unshaken by hits that would have torn a Zero apart. The psychological shift was total. Reports from Japanese Naval Air Command in Rabaul described pilots returning exhausted, defeated, and terrified. One officer wrote, "Their planes cannot be stopped. Their engines will not die. Their bullets pierce even the strongest of ours." The once proud guardians of the Pacific realized they were no longer hunters. They were prey. The Hellcat's power came from more than just its massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine. It came from a design philosophy born out of bitter lessons. Every weakness the Wildcat had exposed early in the war had been burned into the blueprints of the F6F. The engineers didn't just improve performance, they engineered survival. The cockpit was reinforced like a tank. Fuel tanks were armored and self-sealing, saving countless lives. And its guns, 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, could tear through steel at 800 rounds per minute. The Zero's thin skin was no match. In combat tests, pilots described their enemies as turning into confetti under sustained fire. And yet, even as the Americans dominated, they never underestimated their adversaries. Veteran pilots warned new recruits, "The first man to get cocky is the first to die." Meanwhile, Japanese training programs collapsed under the weight of attrition. Their best pilots had been lost over Guadalcanal and Midway, and replacements were rushed through inadequate flight schools. Many had less than 100 hours of flight time before being sent into battle. Against the calm, battle-hardened Hellcat aces of the U.S. Navy, it was a massacre. During one mission near Saipan, U.S. radar picked up a formation of Zeros approaching, 20 planes strong. 12 Hellcats climbed to meet them. 12 minutes later, 19 of the Zeros were down. The 12th fled into a cloud never to be seen again. The American pilots landed with barely a scratch. For the first time in the war, U.S. commanders began to believe total air superiority was not only possible, it was inevitable. But in the chaos of victory, something darker began to haunt the skies, a sense of pity. "We shot them down like they were made of paper," one pilot wrote in his diary. But they kept coming. They always came. Even McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, confessed that his greatest fear was not death. It was becoming numb to it. He said after one mission, "You stop seeing the enemy as men, and you start seeing them as targets. That's when the war wins over your soul." Those words would echo through generations of aviators, and still, the Japanese refused to yield. Outnumbered, outgunned, and flying aircraft that were now obsolete, they fought with a fury that defied logic. In the thick air above Formosa, pilots rammed their crippled Zeros into Hellcats when their guns jammed, desperate to take just one American down with them. Some succeeded, but even that sacrifice could not turn the tide. The industrial might of America was simply too overwhelming. For every Zero destroyed, Japan struggled to build one replacement. For every Hellcat lost, America built 4 more. By the end of 1944, the numbers told a brutal story. The F6F Hellcat had achieved an astonishing kill ratio of 19-1. It wasn't just dominance, it was annihilation. The laughter that had once filled Japanese briefings when they saw the Hellcat's heavy frame had long turned to disbelief. "We thought they were too slow," one surviving Zero pilot later said. "We were wrong. They were unstoppable." As the last Zero plummeted into the ocean during that long Pacific dusk, the sky grew quiet, not in peace, but in exhaustion. The Hellcat pilots returned to their carriers, eyes hollow, uniforms scorched, and faces marked by salt and gunpowder. The deckhands saluted, knowing they were watching history unfold. The exact moment when the empire that once ruled the Pacific skies finally fell from them, swallowed by the horizon it had once claimed. When the F6F Hellcat first darkened the skies over the Pacific, the Japanese command scrambled to recover from the shock. They called emergency councils in Rabaul and Truk Lagoon, desperate to identify what this new monster was. Reconnaissance pilots who survived encounters described a blue-gray beast with wings like armor plates and the roar of a god. The intelligence officers dismissed it as exaggeration until wreckage from a downed Hellcat washed ashore. What they found shattered their pride. Layers of bulletproof glass thicker than anything they had ever used. armor that shrugged off cannon shells, and fuel tanks wrapped in a self-sealing membrane that hissed and healed after being punctured. They could hardly believe such technology existed in quantity. "They are building these like rice," one engineer whispered in disbelief. That was the beginning of realization. Japan was fighting an enemy that had turned industry into a weapon far more powerful than any aircraft. To counter the Hellcat, Japanese designers rushed to modify the Zero and produce desperate stopgaps: the A6M8 with heavier armor, the Raiden Interceptor, even the Shidenkai. But all came too late. The factories could not keep up, and the pilots could not learn fast enough. Every new squadron was swallowed by the blue tide of Hellcats before it even mastered formation flying. Over the Marianas, at the battle that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, hundreds of Japanese planes rose to defend Saipan. Hundreds were burned out of the sky. One Hellcat pilot described it as shooting stars in daylight. The radio chatter was a mix of awe and sorrow, pilots stunned by the ease of their victories, unable to forget the sight of burning parachutes drifting down through the clouds. But behind those clouds, in the steel corridors of American carriers, something else was happening. The Navy was learning the science of air dominance, radar coordination, vector control, and disciplined gunnery. Pilots now fought as a single mind, guided by voices below deck. The Japanese, trained in personal valor and individual duels, were crushed by this unseen network. Each time a Zero tried to surprise a Hellcat from above, radar already knew its position. Each ambush dissolved into chaos before it began. The myth of the invincible Zero died not in a single battle, but in 1,000 radar pings echoing across the Pacific night. Even so, the psychological war raged. Captured Japanese pilots could not comprehend how Americans could be so calm, so methodical, so detached from fear. One of them said during interrogation, "You fight as machines, not men." He meant it as an insult, but historians would later call it the highest compliment to American training. Every engagement, every sortie, every kill was data feeding the machine of war. Still, amid the efficiency, there were moments that pierced the armor of technology, moments of raw humanity. After one fight near the Philippines, a Hellcat pilot found himself flying alongside a crippled Zero. The enemy's cockpit canopy was gone, the pilot slumped and bleeding. Instead of finishing him, the American pulled up his flaps and escorted him until the Zero spiraled into the sea. When he returned to the carrier, he said nothing. He simply removed his helmet and stared at the horizon for a long time. In his logbook under enemy aircraft destroyed, he wrote only one word: mercy. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was the manifestation of industrial might welded to moral exhaustion. Each victory brought less triumph and more silence. The laughter that once filled the ready rooms turned into quiet reflections. "We're killing ghosts now," one pilot said. "They just don't know they're ghosts yet." As the Pacific sun sank red over the endless ocean, the Hellcats formed up for the long flight home, wings catching the last light like blades. Below them, oil fires still burned on the sea, marking the graves of hundreds of Zeros. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling the skies now smoldered beneath them. And in that fiery reflection, even the victors could see the cost of mastery. In the late stages of the Pacific War, when Japan realized that its once dominant air arm was being erased, desperation turned into invention bordering on madness. The engineers who had once prided themselves on lightweight agility were now told to make anything that could reach altitude and intercept the American carrier groups. They stripped the factories of aluminum, melted down household utensils, and used substitute alloys that buckled under stress. Every dawn, Hellcats flew patrols over the vast blue emptiness, spotting smoke from burning islands where Japan's last fighters tried to rise. Each encounter became a one-sided duel, an American pilot watching through gun camera footage as tracers walked neatly across the fragile silhouette of a Zero that folded in half before vanishing into flame. But even the victors were haunted. The Hellcat's 850 caliber Brownings spat streams of fire that looked beautiful from a distance and horrific up close. Pilots reported seeing wings shear off, cockpits explode in brief orange flashes, and sometimes a body tumble free before the wreckage hit the sea. They would climb back into formation, silence filling the radio until someone finally whispered, "Splash one." The efficiency of killing became its own curse. Back in Japan, propaganda painted a different picture. Newspapers spoke of the Shiden Tensei, the divine thunder that would strike the Americans. But inside the hangars, mechanics worked by candlelight, patching bullet-riddled airframes with rice paper and glue. The young men climbing into those planes were barely trained. Many had only a handful of flight hours. They faced the Hellcat squadrons knowing full well they would not return. The command called it duty. Historians would later call it tragedy. When the Americans advanced toward Iwo Jima, radar screens aboard the carriers began to fill with dots, dozens of aircraft converging at once. It wasn't a coordinated formation, it was chaos. Zeros, Betty bombers, and makeshift trainers all flying in one desperate swarm. The Hellcats rose to meet them like a wall of thunder. Within minutes, the sky dissolved into a storm of vapor trails and fireballs. Pilots remembered the smell of burning oil carried even inside their cockpits. They called it the day the sky burned. And yet, amid the slaughter, the Americans began to notice something different. The enemy wasn't trying to escape. The Japanese planes dove straight for the carriers, guns blazing even as they disintegrated. It was the birth of the kamikaze, a tactic born from despair. For every Hellcat pilot who survived that day, the sight of a human missile diving through flak haunted their dreams. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We thought we were fighting pilots. We were fighting death itself." The F6F's strength wasn't just its armor or power, it was the network behind it. Each pilot trusted his wingman, each wingman trusted the radar officer, and every carrier trusted the men turning wrenches below deck. The Japanese had bravery, the Americans had system, and war, in its cruel arithmetic, rewarded the latter. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea, the carriers' decks glowed with the fires of recovery. Dozens of Hellcats lined up, wings folding as deck crews hosed salt and soot off their fuselages. The pilots climbed down, faces blackened, eyes red. They had won again, but victory tasted of ash. The Pacific stretched before them, vast, silent, and littered with wreckage that once bore wings. In the distance, faint flashes marked the death of another Japanese convoy. The ocean reflected those sparks like stars, each one a tiny grave. "They mocked us once," an American said, staring at the horizon. "Now they're gone." And somewhere above those waters, ghosts of Zeros still drifted through the clouds. Wings outstretched, engines silent, falling endlessly into the sea below. By the war's last stretch, the Pacific itself seemed tired of fire and metal. The once invincible Zero had become a relic of a vanished empire, and the Hellcat, born from lessons written in blood, ruled the sky. Yet victory did not come with fanfare. It came with silence, with exhausted men sitting on carrier decks, staring at the horizon they had burned clean. Every pilot knew what it meant to outlive his enemy, to carry the sound of each bullet, each explosion, long after the war drums stopped. The Hellcat had been forged to answer Pearl Harbor's humiliation, but now it flew through skies filled not with rage, but with ghosts. When the first Hellcats touched down on liberated islands, their mechanics walked among twisted wreckage that once mocked them. Bent propellers of Zeros lay half-buried in coral sand. Their rising sun insignias faded and bullet-riddled. American. Flyers who had once feared the name Mitsubishi A6M now spoke of it with a strange respect, not as an enemy machine, but as the grave marker of an age when agility still meant survival. The Hellcat's brute power had rewritten that law. It proved that armor could outlast grace, that speed could be traded for endurance, and that wars are won not by daring aces, but by the relentless rhythm of production and adaptation. In briefing, rooms from Pearl Harbor to Guam, commanders studied the gun camera reels, silver film showing tracers curving like fiery handwriting across the sky, ending with the brief, terrible blossom of an explosion. They weren't cheering. They were calculating, learning how the Hellcat's climb rate, its bullet spread, and its ability to absorb damage had turned dogfighting into a science. Every kill was a data point. Every wrecked zero was a lesson. The war had evolved beyond pride. It had become an equation. And in that equation, Japan could no longer compete. Fuel reserves were gone. The factories that once produced elegant killers now stood as hollow shells, their roofs torn off by B-29 raids, their engineers working by candlelight. The last Zeros that took off were flown by boys barely old enough to shave, their eyes wide behind goggles too large for their faces. Against them came the Hellcats, machines that could climb through rain, take hits that should have killed them, and still bring their pilots home. The sky wasn't a duel anymore. It was execution. When peace finally came, the Hellcats were parked in neat rows under the tropical sun, their metal skins gleaming, their engines ticking as they cooled. Pilots walked past them quietly, touching the noses of their planes as if saying goodbye to old comrades. For all their victory, many couldn't shake the image of the Zeros that had fallen, some bursting into fire, some simply rolling over and vanishing into the blue. They remembered the first time they had seen a Japanese pilot bail out, his parachute blooming against the ocean, and how no one ever saw him again. The Hellcat had saved lives, thousands of them, but it had also transformed the nature of air combat forever. It marked the end of chivalry in the skies and the beginning of industrialized destruction. No longer would courage alone win a battle. The era of the lone ace was over. In its place came the era of the system, the radar, the factory, the assembly line, the carrier, the logistics chain stretching halfway around the world. That was America's real weapon, and the Hellcat was its perfect embodiment. In the museums decades later, veterans would gather and stand before a restored F6F, paint pristine, metal polished, the smell of oil faint in the air. One would whisper to another, "They laughed at her, you know, thought she was too heavy, too slow," and the other would smile and reply, "They stopped laughing when she came for them." Outside, the sky over the Pacific is still the same, endless, cloud-torn, golden at dusk. Somewhere up there, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the echo of 8 50-caliber guns roaring at once, the hum of a radial engine pushing against the wind, and the faint cry of disbelief from those who once ruled the air, until the Hellcat rose and turned their laughter into falling fire. When the final reports were written and the numbers finally told their story, the truth was staggering. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft in just 2 years, more than any other Allied fighter of the war. Its kill ratio, 19-1. For every Hellcat lost, 19 Zeros fell burning into the sea. On paper, it was statistics. In reality, it was the sound of an empire breaking apart in the clouds. The Hellcat hadn't just beaten the Zero, it had buried the legend of Japanese air supremacy beneath the waves of the Pacific. In Tokyo, intercepted radio transcripts told the same grim tale. Squadrons lost in minutes. Bases emptied of planes faster than they could refuel. Pilots reported enemy machines that would not die, their bullets bouncing off the Hellcat's armored belly, their turning advantage meaningless against raw horsepower. What had once been pride became disbelief, then despair. Even the legendary aces, the ones who had terrorized the skies over China and Pearl Harbor, were gone. Their replacements flying with trembling hands and no hope of victory. For the United States Navy, the transformation was total. The same force that once scattered after Japan's early victories now ruled every horizon. Carriers that had fled the Philippines returned with Hellcats stacked wingtip to wingtip, each one a silver promise of dominance. From the Marianas to Okinawa, the rhythm was always the same. Radar-spotted movement, the scramble sirens screamed, engines thundered, and the blue waves below lit up with trails of burning fuel. Every battle told the same story. The Hellcat rose, the Zero fell. But beyond the victories, there was something deeper. A new kind of war had been born. The Hellcat was not built to glorify a single pilot. It was built to make victory repeatable. It was the weaponization of mass production, the proof that when America combined technology, industry, and training, the result was unstoppable. It didn't rely on luck or genius. It relied on systems that worked every time. And that philosophy, that precision, would define every war fought afterward. Still, the men who flew her never saw themselves as gods of the sky. They were survivors. They spoke of missions where flak tore holes through the fuselage, of oil spraying their goggles, of landing on carriers half dead from exhaustion. Some would wake in the night hearing engines that weren't there, feeling the sudden drop of a dive, smelling the ghostly mix of smoke and salt. For them, the Hellcat wasn't just a machine. It was a lifeline between life and oblivion. After Japan's surrender, the Pacific quieted at last. The roaring skies turned still, and the ocean reflected a strange peace that felt almost foreign. The surviving Zeros were gathered in scrapyards, their once feared silhouettes now broken, wings folded like fallen birds. American crews posed beside captured wrecks for photographs, smiling in the sunlight, but the smiles never reached their eyes. Because they knew, every victory had a cost, every kill a life extinguished. The Hellcat's dominance came not from cruelty, but from necessity. It was born out of a lesson learned the hard way, that arrogance kills faster than bullets. Japan had built planes that danced through the air but couldn't survive the war's new rules. America built planes that could take punishment, protect their pilots, and bring them home, again and again. That was the difference. That was the turning point. And so the Pacific War ended not with a single battle, but with a gradual, unstoppable truth. Technology had replaced tradition. The Hellcat was the messenger of that truth, roaring through cloud and smoke like a steel prophecy. From its wings came a new age, one where survival was no longer about skill alone, but about design, discipline, and the courage to adapt. Decades later, as the veterans aged and the last Hellcats found homes in museums, a few surviving Japanese pilots were invited to speak at commemorations. One of them, frail, his hands trembling, stood before a polished Hellcat on display and smiled. "We thought it was ugly," he said softly, voice barely a whisper. "But it was beautiful where it mattered. It brought your boys home." The room fell silent, because in that single line lay the entire war. The Hellcat had not been built for glory. It had been built for survival, and in doing so, it had redefined victory. As the sun sets over the Pacific, its last light glinting off the calm water, you can almost see them still, the silhouettes of fighters frozen in eternal pursuit, one diving, one climbing, their contrails crossing like ghosts of history. The war is over, the laughter long gone, but the lesson remains carved across the endless sky. Mock the machine if you dare, but never underestimate the men who build it to endure.